When I first met Tatiana, it felt like fate had handed me everything I'd ever wanted. She was kind, beautiful, and smart, a perfect partner for the ambitious life I was building. Together, we created a picture-perfect life, a thriving architectural career for me, a close-knit family, and our twin boys, Sasha and Leonid, who became the center of our universe. For years, I thought I had it all. Tatiana's unwavering support and the twins' bright smiles made every challenge seem worthwhile. But looking back, I realize how blind I was to the small cracks in our foundation. Subtle things started to stand out. Tatiana's new guardedness with her phone, her longer hours at the studio, and how Andre, my brother, seemed to visit more frequently than before. At the time, I told myself it was just family being family, but something felt off. Andre had always been the charming one, the one who lit up every room he walked into. I used to admire him for it, even when it felt like I was living in his shadow. So when Tatiana began asking about his plans or laughing a little too hard at his jokes, I brushed it off as harmless. He was my brother, after all. Why would I ever think to question their bond? But then, one evening, a seemingly innocent moment planted the first seed of doubt. I caught a look, a fleeting shared glance between Tatiana and Andre during a family dinner. It was the kind of look that carried meaning, one that didn't belong between a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law. My stomach churned, but I dismissed it. Don't overthink things, I told myself. You're imagining problems that aren't there. Still, doubt has a way of creeping in, like water seeping through cracks. I started noticing more, whispered conversations that ended when I entered the room, Andre showing up unexpectedly, and Tatiana's defensiveness whenever I asked about her day. The perfect life I thought I had was starting to feel like a mirage. The moment everything unraveled began as an ordinary day. I had left work early to surprise Tatiana and the boys. I stopped by a bakery on the way home to pick up her favorite pastries, thinking I'd catch her in a rare moment of downtime. Instead, I walked into a storm I couldn't have prepared for. The house was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. I expected to hear the twins playing or Tatiana bustling in the kitchen. Instead, I found her in the living room, her face pale and drawn as she stared at her phone. When she saw me, her expression flickered with something I couldn't place. Was it fear, guilt, or annoyance? She quickly locked her screen, setting the phone face down on the table. I tried to shake the unease and greeted her warmly. I thought I'd surprise you, I said, holding up the pastries. She barely glanced at them, muttering a distracted thanks. My heart sank. This wasn't the woman I knew. Or perhaps, she was no longer the woman I thought I knew. Later that night, I saw the phone again, lying unattended on the counter. I knew it was wrong, but something compelled me to pick it up. The passcode hadn't changed, and as I swiped it open, I justified my actions with the growing suspicion that had gnawed at me for months. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. A series of messages between Tatiana and Andre. At first, the text seemed harmless, playful even, but as I scrolled further, they became undeniably intimate. My hands shook as I read the words, the pet names, the confessions, the plans to meet. One particular message made my stomach churn. He has no idea, and he never will. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The betrayal was raw, vivid, and all-consuming. My mind raced with images of them together, their shared deceit, and the countless moments they must have laughed at my obliviousness. Anger flared up, but so did pain, a deep, bone-deep ache of having my trust shattered by the two people I should have been able to trust most. I confronted her immediately, unable to contain the storm inside me. Her first reaction wasn't denial but defiance. She accused me of violating her privacy, turning the blame onto me. Why were you going through my phone? She snapped, her voice sharp and cold. But when I showed her the messages, the facade cracked. I can explain, she stammered, but the words sounded hollow. Her excuses poured out in a desperate stream, loneliness, mistakes, and meaningless distractions. But none of it could account for the magnitude of her betrayal. She avoided my eyes, fumbling to piece together a story I wouldn't believe. Finally, in the heat of the argument, I blurted out a question that had been gnawing at me since I read those texts. Are the twins even mine? Her silence was deafening. She didn't deny it. Instead, she lowered her head, her hands trembling as she murmured, I don't know. Those 3 words were like a dagger to the heart. The twins, my boys, my pride, my legacy, might not even be mine. My world spun as I tried to process the gravity of what she had done, the depths of the secrets she had kept from me. The next few days were a blur, filled with a nauseating mix of dread, anger, and disbelief. My home, once my sanctuary, now felt foreign. Tatiana avoided me, retreating to the bedroom or busying herself with tasks that didn't need doing. I, in turn, avoided her. Every glance, every word felt like it carried the weight of her betrayal. But the questions couldn't wait any longer. I had to know. So, I arranged for DNA tests for Sasha and Leonid. It felt cruel, almost invasive, but I needed the truth. The boys, too young to understand, thought it was some kind of game, laughing as the nurse swabbed their mouths. I smiled for their sake, but inside, I was unraveling. Waiting for the results was agony. I replayed every moment of their lives in my mind. Sasha's first steps, Leonid's first word. I'd been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. How could it all be a lie? And yet, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt. The looks between Tatiana and Andrei, the whispers, the calculated way she had kept this secret for so long. The results arrived on a cold, gray morning. I opened the envelope alone in my car, too afraid to read them in the house. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, the words blurring together until I focused on the one line that mattered. Not a match. I sat there, numb, as the reality sank in. The twins weren't mine. I had raised Andrei's children, poured my heart and soul into them, only to discover they carried none of my blood. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air out of my lungs. When I finally went inside, Tatiana was waiting for me. She didn't ask about the results. She already knew. Her face was a mask of guilt and defiance, as if daring me to confront her again. I did. I told her about the results, my voice cold and steady despite the storm raging inside. Her response was as hollow as I expected. She said she didn't know for sure until recently, that she hadn't wanted to hurt me, that it didn't matter because I was the one who raised them. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper. How could she believe it didn't matter? It mattered to me. It mattered more than she could ever understand. That evening, I sat alone in the twins' room while they slept. Watching them breathe peacefully, I realized something. Biology or not, they were still my sons. I had been their father every step of the way. That bond, at least, was real. But it didn't erase the pain or the betrayal. It didn't fix what Tatiana and Andrei had done. It didn't make it easier to look at them and not see the lies staring back at me. I knew then that my life would never be the same, but I also knew I had to face this head-on, for the twins, if not for myself. The days that followed were some of the most difficult of my life. The air in the house was heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Tatiana and I barely exchanged a word, navigating the same space as strangers. Even the boys began to sense something was wrong. Their usual carefree laughter had turned into cautious whispers, as if they were afraid to upset a delicate balance they couldn't understand. I realized I needed to think clearly, to make decisions that would protect my future and, most importantly, the boys' future. Tatiana's betrayal had already stolen so much from me, but I wouldn't let it rob the twins of their stability. I couldn't let her recklessness dictate the rest of our lives. The first thing I did was secure my finances. I met with a lawyer to understand my options, making it clear I wanted everything to remain above board but firmly in my control. The house, the savings, the investments, I ensured they were legally protected. Tatiana would not get another chance to take advantage of me. I also started creating a trust fund for Sasha and Leonid. Regardless of the DNA results, they were my sons in every way that mattered. The fund would ensure their education and future were secure, no matter what happened between me and Tatiana. I kept the process discreet. There was no need to involve her in something she had no right to influence anymore. My lawyer recommended gathering evidence, not just of the affair but of anything that could affect custody or property division. It felt dirty, like digging through the rubble of my own life, but I knew it was necessary. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I reviewed phone records, messages, even bank statements. Each discovery chipped away at whatever lingering attachment I might have had to Tatiana. It wasn't just her betrayal with Andrei, it was the way she'd systematically deceived me for years. At the same time, I began to quietly distance myself from Tatiana emotionally. I no longer sought her out for answers or closure. She had nothing left to offer me but her lies, and I refused to let her manipulate me further. Every interaction became calculated, my words chosen carefully to avoid unnecessary conflict. I could see the frustration in her eyes, but I didn't care. This wasn't about her anymore. I also found solace in work, throwing myself into my projects with a focus I hadn't felt in years. Designing buildings felt like reclaiming a small piece of control in a life that had spiraled so far out of it. The precision, the structure, the order, it was everything my personal life was lacking. Still, at night, when the house was silent and the boys were asleep, the weight of it all would come crashing down. I'd sit in the dark, replaying everything in my mind, questioning where it had all gone wrong. How could I have been so blind? How had the woman I loved turned into someone I barely recognized? And how had my own brother betrayed me so completely? I wasn't ready for a confrontation yet. Not with Tatiana, not with Andre. I needed to build my defenses, to ensure I wasn't acting out of anger or impulse. This was a game of endurance now, and I intended to come out of it with my dignity intact. It was inevitable that the dam would break. Weeks of silence and careful avoidance couldn't hold back the growing tension between us. I had prepared myself for this moment, but when it finally came, it wasn't on my terms. Tatiana cornered me one evening after dinner, her face set with a mix of frustration and desperation. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp. I stayed seated at the dining table, gesturing for her to continue. If she wanted this conversation, I wasn't going to make it easy for her. She launched into a stream of justifications, excuses, and half-hearted apologies. She spoke about how she felt neglected, how she and Andre just happened, and how she had been trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape. Each word was like gasoline on the fire inside me. Did she think I would buy into this twisted narrative? Did she think I would absolve her because she felt bad? When I finally spoke, my voice was calm but cold. I told her I had no interest in her excuses, no patience for her self-pity. You weren't trapped, Tatiana. You made choices. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed our family. Her mask of defiance slipped for a moment, and I saw something raw in her eyes. But then she lashed out. She accused me of being distant, of prioritizing work over her, of not noticing the signs. It was almost laughable, her trying to shift the blame onto me as if I had pushed her into my brother's arms. I let her words wash over me, waiting for her to run out of steam before I dropped the final blow. "I know everything," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. "I know about the lies. I know about the nights you were with him. I know about the money you used to cover your tracks. And I know you've continued to see him, even after I confronted you." Her face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She hadn't expected me to have the full picture. She hadn't expected me to fight back. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" I asked, my voice breaking for the first time. "To us. To the boys. You've shattered everything we built, everything I thought we were." She tried to respond, but I held up my hand. "No, you don't get to explain this away. You don't get to rewrite the story to make yourself the victim. You and Andre destroyed this family. And now you'll live with the consequences." Just then, Sasha and Leonid peeked into the room, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Tatiana quickly turned away, wiping her tears. I knelt down and reassured them, telling them everything was fine, even though it was far from the truth. They didn't need to know the details yet, but they deserved to feel safe. That night, as Tatiana retreated to the bedroom, I sat on the couch, staring into the darkness. The confrontation had left me drained, but it also felt like a necessary purge. There was no going back now. The wounds were out in the open, and the healing, or the tearing apart, had to begin. After the confrontation, the house fell into an eerie, fragile calm. Tatiana kept her distance, her presence a ghostly reminder of the betrayal that lingered in every corner. Andre, predictably, remained silent and out of sight. He hadn't reached out, and I had no intention of seeking him out. My focus now was singular. The boys. Sasha and Leonid were my world, and despite everything, that hadn't changed. If anything, my resolve to protect and nurture them had only deepened. I couldn't let my anger or bitterness taint the bond we shared. They didn't deserve to suffer for the choices of the adults around them. I began making a conscious effort to spend more time with them. We played soccer in the park, built model airplanes on the weekends, and worked on puzzles in the evenings. They thrived on the attention, their laughter echoing through the house like a salve for my aching heart. But it wasn't always easy. There were moments, small, painful reminders, that cut deeper than I expected. Sasha's smile, so similar to Andrei's, or the way Leonid tilted his head when he was curious, just like his uncle used to. I worked hard to push those thoughts aside, to focus on the here and now. They were my boys. They always had been, and they always would be. The hardest part was navigating the questions they began to ask. Kids are perceptive, and they could tell something had shifted. Sasha asked me one night, "Why doesn't Mom eat with us anymore?" I froze for a moment, unsure how to answer. I settled on a version of the truth they could handle. "Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out," I said, ruffling his hair. "But no matter what, I'm here for you." Their trust in me felt like both a gift and a responsibility. I wasn't just their father. I was their anchor, their constant in a world that was becoming increasingly uncertain. And in many ways, they were mine. Their innocence and love reminded me that not everything in my life was broken beyond repair. I also began to undo some of the damage caused by Tatiana's manipulation. She had been so skilled at controlling the narrative, subtly weaving doubts about me into their minds. "Dad works too much," she would say, or "Your dad's always so serious." I didn't counter her words directly, but I made a point to show them another side of me. The side that laughed at their silly jokes, that stayed up late to help with school projects, that cheered louder than anyone at their soccer games. Bit by bit, the walls she had built between us began to crumble. They hugged me tighter, sought me out more often, and looked at me with a trust that fueled my determination. I couldn't undo what she had done, but I could rewrite our story from this point forward. Through it all, I began to see a path forward, not just for me, but for the boys. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but I was determined to rebuild the foundation of our family. Even if it was smaller, even if it looked different, it would be ours. It would be real. The betrayal left a gaping wound, but I realized I couldn't let it define me. I needed to do something with the pain, to transform it into a force that could build instead of destroy. That's when the idea for the foundation came to me. A place where people like me, like the boys, could find support and strength amidst the chaos of broken families. I started small, researching organizations that helped families affected by betrayal, divorce, and fractured trust. The stories I came across mirrored my own. Men and women blindsided by infidelity, children caught in the crossfire, and people trying to rebuild their lives piece by piece. It struck a chord. These weren't just abstract anecdotes. They were reflections of the struggle I faced every day. The foundation began as a concept, a way to offer counseling, legal resources, and financial guidance for those navigating the fallout of betrayal. I reached out to colleagues, friends, and even distant acquaintances, gathering a network of people who shared my vision. Surprisingly, many of them had their own stories of heartbreak, their own reasons for wanting to help. Work on the foundation became my escape, a productive outlet for the emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. Late nights that might have been spent brooding were now filled with drafting plans, making calls, and laying the groundwork for something bigger than myself. It felt good to have a purpose again, to channel my pain into something that could make a difference. Meanwhile, life at home continued to shift. Tatiana had grown increasingly withdrawn, her attempts to reconnect half-hearted at best. She asked about my plans one evening, her tone laced with suspicion. "You're always working on something these days." "What is it?" she asked, crossing her arms. I told her about the foundation, about my plans to help others in situations like mine. Her reaction was predictable, a mix of defensiveness and dismissal. "So, you're turning this into some kind of crusade," she scoffed. "Is this your way of punishing me?" I didn't rise to her bait. "This isn't about you, Tatiana," I said simply. "It's about moving forward." The boys were curious, too. I kept the explanation age-appropriate, telling them I was working on a project to help families. Like superheroes? Leonid asked, his eyes lighting up. I smiled and nodded, ruffling his hair. Something like that, I said, and the comparison stuck. From then on, they started calling me Superdad, a title I wore like a badge of honor. As the foundation took shape, I found myself changing as well. I was still angry, still grieving, but I was also healing. Every meeting, every small victory for the foundation, felt like a step toward reclaiming my life. It wasn't just about helping others, it was about proving to myself that I could rise above the betrayal, that I was more than the sum of my pain. The day we officially launched the foundation was a turning point. Standing in front of a modest crowd, I spoke about resilience, about finding strength in the face of adversity. The applause that followed wasn't just for the foundation, it was for the journey, for surviving, for choosing to build instead of break. That night, as I tucked the boys into bed, Sasha hugged me tightly. "We're proud of you, Dad," he said, his voice muffled against my shirt. It was a simple statement, but it meant everything. In that moment, I knew I was on the right path. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had found a purpose, and so had I. As my foundation grew, so did the distance between Tatiana and me. She must have sensed the shift, though she still clung to the remnants of her old life, the life where she could manipulate situations and control outcomes. But cracks began to show in her facade, and soon, her carefully constructed reality started to crumble. It began subtly. I overheard a tense phone conversation one evening while the boys and I were building a model rocket in the living room. Tatiana's voice, usually so composed, was raised and shaky. She was arguing with Andre, though she tried to keep her words vague. "You promised me," she hissed, slamming the bedroom door. I caught Sasha and Leonid glancing at each other, concern flickering across their young faces. I quickly distracted them, but the tension in the house was palpable. Over the following weeks, it became clear that things between Tatiana and Andre were unraveling. She grew more irritable, snapping at the smallest inconveniences. Her once pristine appearance became less polished, and her excuses to leave the house grew increasingly transparent. The lies that had once come so easily to her seemed to weigh heavier now. I didn't need to confront her to know the truth. Andre was pulling away. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe he'd simply grown bored, but his absence in her life was unmistakable. The man she had chosen over her husband, the man whose children she'd passed off as mine, was abandoning her. One day, she approached me with an air of forced nonchalance. "Have you spoken to Andre?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes betrayed her desperation. I shook my head, keeping my voice neutral. "No, and I have no plans to." Her expression flickered, and she quickly changed the subject. But the question lingered in the air, heavy with implications. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. The final blow came a few weeks later. Tatiana received a letter in the mail, its contents sending her into a spiral. Though she tried to hide it, I saw her pacing the kitchen late that night, clutching the paper as tears streamed down her face. I didn't ask what it said. I didn't need to. Andre had cut ties, leaving her to deal with the aftermath alone. I should have felt satisfaction at her unraveling, but I didn't. If anything, I felt a hollow kind of pity. She had built her world on lies, and now it was collapsing under its own weight. She had burned every bridge, including the one that led to me, and she was standing alone in the ashes. Tatiana's fall didn't just impact her, it affected the boys, too. They noticed her mood swings, her absence during important moments, and her growing unpredictability. Sasha once asked me, "Is Mom okay? She seems sad." It broke my heart to hear the worry in his voice. "She's going through a tough time," I said gently. "But we'll be okay, I promise." Andre, for his part, stayed out of sight. He didn't call, didn't visit, didn't even send a note of apology. His silence was deafening, but it spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. For all his charm and bravado, he was a coward at heart, unwilling to face the destruction he had caused. As Tatiana and Andre's lives crumbled, mine continued to rebuild. I didn't gloat or seek revenge. It wasn't worth it. Instead, I focused on what mattered: my sons, my foundation, and the life I was forging from the wreckage. Watching them fall apart wasn't satisfying, but it was a stark reminder of the cost of their choices. It was a cost I refused to let myself or my sons pay. In the aftermath of Tatiana and Andrei's collapse, life took on a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of pain and doubt, but it was steady, and that was enough for me. Slowly, I began to find pieces of myself that had been buried under the weight of betrayal. I threw myself into my work, both at the firm and with the foundation. Designing buildings felt different now, more meaningful, as if every blueprint was a metaphor for rebuilding my life. The foundation flourished, gaining traction as more people shared their stories and sought help. It became a beacon of hope for others, and in turn, it gave me purpose. My relationship with Sasha and Leonid deepened during this time. We developed new traditions: Friday night movie marathons, weekend hikes, and impromptu pancake breakfasts. Their laughter became my lifeline, their trust my greatest reward. They still asked questions about Tatiana, about why things had changed, but I navigated those conversations carefully, always prioritizing their sense of security. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Sasha said something that caught me off guard. "You're like a superhero, Dad," he said, grinning. "You always take care of us, no matter what." Leonid nodded in agreement, his eyes wide with admiration. Their words stayed with me, a reminder of why I had to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, Tatiana's attempts to reconcile became more frequent. She'd approach me with tentative smiles and carefully rehearsed apologies, trying to chip away at the wall I'd built between us. "I've changed," she'd say. "I want to fix things for the boys." But her words rang hollow. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the fear of being left behind. I refused her advances, not out of spite, but because I knew the damage was irreparable. She had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and I had no intention of stepping back into the web of lies she had spun. "It's too late, Tatiana," I told her one day, my voice firm but calm. "The only thing we can do now is be good parents to the boys. That's all I can offer." Her reaction was a mix of anger and sorrow. She lashed out, accusing me of giving up too easily, of not fighting for our family. But I didn't take the bait. I had fought, harder than she could ever understand, and now I was done. My focus was on the future, not the past. As Tatiana faded further into the background, I began to open myself up to new possibilities. I reconnected with old friends, attended social events, and even entertained the idea of dating again. It wasn't about replacing what I'd lost, it was about rediscovering who I was outside of the chaos. One day, while visiting the foundation, I met someone who made me realize how far I'd come. Elena was a volunteer, passionate about helping families heal. Her warmth and kindness were infectious, and our conversations felt effortless. She didn't pry into my past, but she listened when I chose to share. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of something I thought I'd never feel again. The boys took to Elena immediately, their laughter echoing in her presence. Watching them together filled me with a quiet sense of joy. It was too early to call it anything more than friendship, but it was a start, a step toward reclaiming the life I deserved. As I stood in the doorway one evening, watching Sasha and Leonid play in the yard, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had hurt, deeply, but it hadn't defined me. I had taken the pieces of my shattered life and built something stronger, something real. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that the future might hold something beautiful. The road to closure wasn't linear. Some days were easier than others, but I learned to accept that healing wasn't about erasing the pain, it was about learning to live alongside it. The betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to be the defining chapter. As time passed, Tatiana became less involved in our lives. She tried, in her own flawed way, to maintain a relationship with Sasha and Leonid, but the boys seemed to sense the strain. They loved her, of course, but they began to gravitate toward the stability I provided. They needed consistency, and I was determined to give them that. I continued to work on the foundation, and it became a place where I not only helped others but found pieces of myself. Hearing stories of resilience and redemption inspired me, reminding me that pain could be a catalyst for growth. The foundation also became a bridge to new opportunities. Elena and I grew closer through our shared work, our bond deepening with each project we tackled together. One day, as we stood in the middle of a bustling community event, she turned to me with a smile. "You've built something incredible here," she said. Her words hit me with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about the foundation, it was about my life. I had built something incredible from the ruins, and I had every reason to be proud. Closure with Andre came in a way I hadn't expected. He reached out to me months after the fallout, sending a letter filled with apologies and justifications. I read it once, then set it aside. I didn't need his words to heal, I had already moved beyond him. The letter stayed in a drawer, unopened and unimportant. For the boys' sake, I remained civil with Tatiana. I encouraged their relationship with her, even when it hurt to see her try to step back into their lives. But I kept my boundaries firm. She would always be their mother, but she was no longer my partner. That chapter was closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. As the years went by, Sasha and Leonid grew into thoughtful, kind young men. Watching them thrive was my greatest accomplishment. They knew the truth about their parentage, but it didn't change how they saw me. "You're our dad," Sasha said one evening, his voice steady and sure. "That's all that matters." Their words solidified something I had always known deep down. Love was stronger than blood. I had been there for them in every way that mattered, and nothing could take that away.